Thank you very much for that introduction, David. And amongst the other jobs I've done, I've been Permanent Secretary of the Home Office. And if you connect together my experience in that side of government, as David says, my experience in the intelligence and security side of government, I want to explain to you that what is going on as we speak is what I describe as a phase change in the relationship between the secret state, the secret world of intelligence, the British public, and the Parliament. And one way of looking at this is what is going on is that the secret activity of the state is for the first time being fully brought under the modern rule of law. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But just think that the United Kingdom, we are the first country in Europe to attempt to do this. I hope we will not be the last. It's a change that has been coming for 500 years. And if I had more than 15 minutes, I would take you back 500 years to Walsingham and Queen Elizabeth I and track the different stages by which the British state has used secret intelligence activity. But since I don't have that luxury, I'll start much closer to home in the summer of 2013. And you all remember the headlines. And some of you said, oh, well, we always suspected it. And some of you would have said, good Lord, can they really be doing that? And I describe these as years of digital revelation, as the general public and most parliamentarians woke up to the private sector monetizing data, to the intelligence agencies using digital intelligence techniques. Some of what got reported wasn't quite right, some of it was misunderstood by the journalists, but there was enough there to kickstart another stage in my 500-year journey. And it accelerated what was going to happen anyway, which was bringing all that secret activity under the rule of law. It also kicked off what I would describe as a moral panic across Europe about privacy. It led to investigations by the Bundestag, investigations by the European Parliament, endless court cases brought by, indeed, some of the people in this audience I recognize, against the government, against GCHQ. So those were the years of digital revelation. And then, sadly, we began to realize in 2015 and 2016 that this activity had a purpose. And this was a painful realization. And some of the countries who had, as it were, shunned the United Kingdom and the United States and its intelligence gathering then came running saying, we want to do this too. Can you teach us how to do digital intelligence? Because we have some very, very serious threat problems in Europe. And the same was true in the cyber world, where those years were years in which we had the largest ever commercial fraud for gain attack. We had the largest ever hack. We had the weaponization of information, and we've talked about that earlier today. And again, as today has shown us, intelligence is one of the keys to cybersecurity. And that point has been made today several times. So what has been actually going on in the last 10 years? One way of looking at it is to say what has been happening is a global coincidence. On the one hand, urgent demands for information about the people who mean us harm And by that I mean the dictators and the terrorists and the insurgents and the people traffickers and the narcotics gangs and the paedophile rings and all the rest of them. Coinciding, and I think it is a coincidence, with the fact that we have been placing our personal information in the digital world increasingly, certainly 10 years, but particularly the last 5 years. And what has happened is a dynamic interaction between the world of intelligence and the digital spaces, where the intelligence officers have said, well, if that information is now being collected by airlines or it's governments have digital passport databases or credit card payment databases, lawfully, we can find ways of accessing that information. It will make our job easier. And the intelligence agencies have been looking at the technologies and saying, we could now develop a bit of malware, we could drop it on a website on the dark net used by paedophile groups, and we could track them back to find out who is actually doing live streaming of child abuse coming from the other side of the world. And that dynamic interaction has been going on for the last 5 years, certainly, and it's set to go on, continuing. And the question that I'm addressing is, how much of this are we prepared to allow? How far do we put that interaction under the constraints of the rule of law, our laws? Which brings me, if 2013-14 were years of digital revelation, and 15 and 16 have been the years when we woke up to the need for intelligence to confront the threats we face. 2017 and the years that follow had better be the years of reconciliation, in which we recognize, as a mature democracy, it is possible to have sufficient security and sufficient respect for privacy. You don't have to trade them off. You can have enough of both. And the key to that is the rule of law. The rule of law, there's lots of statute law. In the old days, it was the royal prerogative, often secret directives issued under the royal prerogative. Today, we insist on statute law that is available, the citizen can read. But we now insist, and the courts very recently have been insisting, on a further condition. Not only must there be black letter law, it must be comprehensible. So we, the citizens, must be able to understand the way in which the authorities are using perfectly lawful powers to obtain the information they need for their investigations. Which brings me to the bill, to the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is passing through its final stages of Parliament as we speak. And that provides for the rule of law. It provides for transparency. There's been an unparalleled debate on the issue. It provides for regulation and warrants and judicial oversight. And crucially, it also embodies, right at the very beginning of the bill, the concept of restraint of privacy rights. If we look at the contents of the bill, we'd find some very powerful tools. Powerful not just for tracking terrorists, but powerful too for accessing in bulk data in order to identify, classify, and attribute malware attacks. And you would find the arrangements for interception in bulk, the arrangements for equipment interference, as it's euphemistically called in the bill, that's its official title. You probably think of computer network exploitation or hacking. And bulk personal data sets held by the government, which can be data mined, and those by the private sector, which can also be lawfully accessed. And all of those methods, which are the totality of the methods used in the British intelligence establishment in the digital world, are now regulated, or will be regulated, under this Act. And we'll be the first country in Europe to actually legislate, to regulate that, to put it under judicial supervision, to have judicial review and sign off on warrants and all the rest of it. So the National Cybersecurity Centre, I am delighted to see, is reporting to the director of GCHQ, the intelligence agency. They have said publicly they are proud to be associated with GCHQ. They will be in a glossy new building, which will be very much more open than the donut, and their address starts with open door, which it will need to be. This is part of, as it were, the transparency that I was talking about. So let me conclude just with tackling one question, which is there an inherent contradiction between obtaining the intelligence we need to keep ourselves safe and working to secure the systems, including the systems used by the bad guys? So I invite you to think about three levels of activity: our everyday internet use, the work of law enforcement, and down there in the black zone, the work of the intelligence agencies. And the priority, it's very clear for the British government at the moment, is the top level. So the public, business, finance, us, we need strong encryption because we are completely and totally dependent for our social and economic future on the integrity of the internet and confidence in the internet. And we all know that strong encryption helps the criminals and the terrorists. So the recent 2 German attacks, the terrorist, as he pulled out his knife to try and murder somebody, was in real-time contact via his secure app with his handler in Syria. That's just one of the consequences of having secure encryption. But the priority is we need the secure encryption. So law enforcement is doing its best to try and target the criminals and the terrorists. And what they need more than anything else is access to communications data, metadata, internet connection records to establish who is contacting whom. If you ask the police services, they will say this rather than content is what is really important. But they're understaffed, underskilled, they're under huge difficulties to tackle the problem. So the intelligence agencies, lawfully in this country, are able to try and help them. But what they need, most of all, is covert access to bulk data to discover new threats and new malware. And you can say, well, goodness, there's a contradiction here. How are you going to manage it? And the answer to that question is you can't manage it. You have to satisfice. So you cannot have a system where we simply take the top level and say, we'll make that absolutely secure and a paradise for criminals. And you can't take the bottom layer and say, intelligence agencies, it's like the old days, it's the royal prerogative, just go ahead and do whatever you think is necessary to keep the public safe. You need that balance of security and respect for privacy. So I will conclude at that point. I hope I have given the impression of a phase change or a paradigm shift, if you want to call it that. It's a very different world, this, of transparency and judicial oversight from the one that we have actually quite successfully run for the last 10 years or 15 years. It is different. It will be a challenge, but I am very confident that my old colleagues in the intelligence community are going to give it their best shot. Thank you.
So David, when it comes down to it, there's a contract of trust between the security layer and the state and the citizen. And I guess a lot of citizens have become a bit cynical as over time more and more stories have come out that the authorities have taken shortcuts, have not necessarily respected the rule of law. There was a case reported this week about bulk collection of data, and maybe the goalposts changed, but it was reported that it had been unlawful. The way you explain it here is persuasive in terms of solving a very big problem that affects all of us. But you're still going to have to persuade the public that the police forces, that the national organisations are not going to take shortcuts because they think it's not necessarily going to come out.
The example you give actually illustrates the point, because GCHQ, for example, was not taking shortcuts. They were not operating outside what it was then believed to be the parameters of the law. Everything they did, they could find a bit of black letter law to justify it. The problem was, put it all together, the public didn't really understand the system. So the court, very sensibly, and I think this is part of this phase change, the court, in a number of judgments, has said the rule of law demands that transparency, so you know how the law can affect you. Section 94 of the Telecommunications Act, who knew the way in which that was being used by GCHQ, or Section 7 of the 1994 Intelligence Services. People didn't know how the whole system worked, even although individually, every act, they had the right warrant, they had the right authorities. And that's a big change. It's only in the last few years that this concept of the rule of law involving that kind of transparency has come about. It would have happened anyway, I think, public attitudes. The other thing I'd add is something that Dame Honora O'Neill, the philosopher, has taught me, which is stop talking about trust and talk about trustworthiness. Trust is a very abstract concept. Trustworthiness you can measure. It's about, do you have repeated patterns of behavior in which you do what you say, you act with integrity, and so on. And that allows me to believe you are a trustworthy individual. Trust is a kind of abstraction. I think it's very difficult to get your hands around. Trustworthiness, I think the authorities are going to have to prove their trustworthiness, because as the judges report, they're going to have to be able to demonstrate that everything they've done is in accordance with this new act. I think it's a model for Europe and wider. I think it's the first time we will have seen this attempt to come clean, look ahead, look at the technical changes and developments which will come, and say each time one of these things comes along, we're going to have to rewrite the rules and publish them and show this is how we are trying to catch the bad guys. If at any stage Parliament says, no, we don't want you to do that, if that's the democratic will, fine, they won't do it.
One other quick question. At Wired, we're always telling stories about the innovators, the people inventing new ways to solve problems. And it turns out that the bad guys can be pretty innovative, using social networks to radicalize people 1,000 miles away, using their secret encrypted Telegram groups or whatever other apps they're using. How innovative can the big established intelligence agencies in the UK be when faced with these startups?
The historical record is the UK has been remarkably successful in bringing in slightly different kinds of mind, particularly, of course, during pressure of war, Bletchley Park and all of that. But there are lots of other examples. So we can do it because we're probably the right scale. If you're the United States, it's so big. If you're a small European country, you probably haven't got the scale to be able to leverage the innovation. So from that point of view, we're in a good place. Is there a contradiction between what I've described as all the, if you like, bureaucracy of oversight, regulation, more warrants, judicial reviews, and having fast-acting, quick, responsive people who are being innovative? We'll have to wait and see. I think they'll make it work, but it's just a risk I flag up.
Thank you for making the case so clearly. Sir David Omand.